Hello, everyone. Tonight I want to take you into a story that sounds so impossible, so chilling, that most people dismiss it as folklore, a legend whispered among travelers. Yet every legend has a seed of truth, and this one will keep you wondering long after the story ends. Imagine, if you will, a small town surrounded by rolling hills, cut off from motorways and modern noise, a place that looked like it belonged to another time. This town was called Ravenshollow. Its name rarely appeared on maps, and if it did, it was usually misspelt, almost as though the land itself resisted being remembered. For decades, Ravenshollow lived quietly, a community of farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen. They weren't rich, but they were proud, keeping to their traditions and living by the rhythm of the seasons. Outsiders who stumbled across the place sometimes said it felt as though the town itself was stuck in the past, as though the 20th century had never quite arrived. Wooden carts creaked down cobblestone lanes, oil lamps glowed in windows long after the world had turned electric, and the church bell still marked the hours when most places relied on digital clocks. There was something frozen about Ravenshollow, but no one could quite put their finger on what. Then, one evening in late autumn, a thick fog rolled into the town. It was denser than any mist the villagers had ever seen before, swallowing the streets in minutes, curling around the rooftops and choking the lantern light until only faint halos shone through. Many said it smelled faintly of iron or damp earth freshly dug. Dogs howled, livestock kicked their stalls, and parents hurried their children indoors, closing shutters tight. That night, the bells rang out for 9 o'clock, and by the time the last chime faded, Ravenshollow had gone silent. Not just the people, but everything. The wind stopped, the insects stopped, the very air seemed to stand still, and when the first travelers came through 30 years later, they discovered a scene that should have been impossible. But let's not jump ahead too quickly. To understand the horror of Ravenshollow, you need to know how it was discovered. 30 years after that fog, a pair of hikers came down from the hills. They had been following old sheep paths and lost track of the trail, wandering into a valley no map seemed to mention. At first they thought they were lucky to find a town at all, because their supplies had been running low. But as they descended the slope and the roofs of Ravenshollow came into view, a creeping unease filled them. The chimneys were dark, the streets empty. Windows stood open as though abandoned in haste, curtains swaying in a wind that didn't seem to touch the trees. And yet the town looked perfectly preserved, not ruined, not weathered, but waiting. When the hikers entered the first house, they found a table laid for supper. Plates were set with half-finished meals, bread sat in baskets, cups of tea had long since dried into stains. A chair was toppled over as though someone had stood up in a hurry, but there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. They searched house after house and found the same thing: beds turned down, lamps unlit, food uneaten, tools left mid-task. It was as though the town had paused in the middle of a single moment and never resumed. The hikers, terrified but unable to resist, stayed long enough to explore the church. That was where they found the clock still ticking. The mechanism had long rusted, but the hands pointed forever to 9 o'clock. Beneath the tower, the air was stale and cold. A faint smell lingered, sharp and metallic, though they could not place it. They fled the town before nightfall, stumbling back to civilization with wild stories that few believed. But word spread, as such tales do, and soon journalists, urban explorers, and seekers began searching for Ravenshollow. And here is where the story turns darker, because 30 years after the fog, someone finally returned to the town with proof. A journalist named Howard Blake, known for chasing fringe stories, found the valley and walked into Ravenshollow carrying a tape recorder and a camera. His footage was shaky, grainy, but chilling. It showed the same abandoned homes, the same meals untouched on tables, and finally, the church. But when he played back the tape that evening, he swore he could hear faint voices beneath his own breathing. Whispers, like a crowd murmuring just beyond comprehension. His camera recorded shadows flickering across the windows, though no one else was there. Howard's notes, later published in a small magazine, ended with a single chilling line, "They are not gone. They are only waiting to wake." And then, incredibly, Ravenshollow did wake. On the night of Howard's disappearance, a storm broke over the valley. Lightning split the hills, thunder rolled like cannon fire, and those living in nearby villages swore they saw a strange glow on the horizon. When they ventured toward the valley the next morning, they found Ravenshollow alive. Smoke rose from chimneys, lights burned in windows, and villagers walked the streets as though nothing had happened. But here's the nightmare: for them, no time had passed. They believed it was still the evening of the fog. Their clothes had not aged, their food was fresh, and they could not comprehend why strangers flooded into their town asking questions. Families embraced their children who, impossibly, had not grown a day older. The world had moved on, but Ravenshollow had been preserved in some pocket of stillness, untouched for 30 years. Authorities tried to investigate, of course. Scientists studied the soil, the air, the water. Historians cross-checked records and found that indeed 30 years of life had been stolen from these people. Some insisted it was mass hysteria, others suggested a natural gas leak, a hallucinogenic effect, but no one could explain how the villagers had not aged. DNA samples confirmed it. The children born before the fog were still children when the fog lifted, while their peers in neighboring villages were adults with families of their own. It was as though Ravenshollow had stepped outside of time. And yet, the strangeness did not end there. Those who left the town soon began to suffer. A few tried to start new lives in nearby cities, but they were plagued by nightmares, waking in the night convinced they were still trapped in the fog. Some reported seeing figures standing at the foot of their beds, villagers who had never left Ravenshollow, staring silently until the dreamer woke screaming. Within months, many of them either returned to the town or disappeared altogether. Those who stayed behind claimed they felt something pressing down on them like an unseen weight. The church bells, which should have been silent for decades, began to ring at odd hours, though no one was in the tower. The townsfolk spoke less and less of the lost years, as though discussing it invited something to return. And visitors who came looking for answers often left shaken, saying they felt as though dozens of eyes were watching them from behind shuttered windows. But the most unsettling part was what happened every evening as the clock neared 9. Without fail, a hush fell over Ravenshollow. Birds grew quiet, footsteps slowed, conversations faltered. People locked their doors and gathered their families close, staring at their clocks with dread. Because deep down, every villager knew the fog would return. It was only a matter of when. The strangest thing about Ravenshollow was how quickly the outside world lost interest. At first, reporters swarmed the valley. Scientists tested every corner of the town. Conspiracy theorists shouted about portals, government experiments, even alien interference. But after a few months, the stories grew quieter. Newspapers stopped sending journalists. Researchers pulled out without explanation, almost as though the town itself demanded to be forgotten again. Yet for those who had seen it, Ravenshollow was unforgettable. Something about it clung to you like a stain that never washed away. The villagers tried to live normally, but there was nothing normal left about their lives. Children who should have been adults played in the same streets as their grown siblings from outside villages, creating a haunting mirror of time's cruelty. Some families embraced, overjoyed at their reunion. Others broke apart, unable to accept that their loved ones had been frozen while they themselves had grown older, weaker, closer to death. Imagine being a mother who aged 3 decades while your son remained a boy of 12. Imagine seeing him run into your arms while your body betrayed you, frail and lined, unable to recognize the person staring back from your own reflection. The joy was always tempered by grief. The government offered to relocate the villagers, to provide homes in nearby cities, but most refused. Something bound them to Ravenshollow. Those who tried to leave never lasted long. A teacher moved to London to escape the whispers of neighbors who suspected she was cursed. but within a year she was dead, her body found in her flat with no sign of struggle, no cause of death the coroner could name. Others simply vanished, their belongings left behind, doors locked from the inside. The official line was that Ravenshollow was free to integrate with the world, but unofficially it became a place avoided by travelers, a valley whispered about in pubs but never visited. Howard Blake's camera was never found. His notes remain the only record of his journey, and some believed he had become part of the town's secret, absorbed into its waking nightmare. And yet, locals began to notice that some of the villagers no longer seemed entirely themselves. A boy who had once been playful and bright returned from the fog with eyes too old, as if he had seen centuries. He would sit for hours in silence, staring at the hills as though listening to voices carried on the wind. An elderly priest, who should have been frail, walked the streets at night with renewed vigor, his lips moving in silent prayers to a god no one else recognized. Even the livestock, perfectly preserved as they were, seemed wrong. Cows mooed at nothing, chickens pecked at invisible grain, and dogs barked at corners where shadows seemed to linger. The most terrifying tale came from a young woman named Clara, who had been only 17 the night the fog arrived. For her, no time had passed. She had closed her eyes as the mist filled her bedroom and opened them 30 years later to find strangers in her home. She refused to leave Ravenshollow, claiming she had seen things in the fog. Not just emptiness, but shapes. Faces pressing against the mist, hands brushing against her windows, voices whispering her name. She told anyone who would listen that the town had not merely slept, it had been watched. And whatever watched them was waiting for something. As the years passed, the outside world all but forgot Ravenshollow, but those who lived near the valley told stories of strange lights on the horizon, of bells ringing when the church stood empty, of voices on the wind that carried much further than sound should travel. Farmers whispered that their livestock grew restless whenever the moon was full, staring toward Ravenshollow as though sensing something approaching. And always, the villagers of Ravenshollow continued their ritual. Doors locked at 9, shutters drawn, candles extinguished. They waited as though the fog might return at any moment to reclaim them, and one evening it did. It began the same way as before. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of iron. The birds fell silent, dogs whined, children clutched at their parents' sleeves. A gray wall crept over the hills, swallowing the fields, rolling across the cobblestones until the first houses disappeared. The villagers gathered in terror, some praying, some weeping, some standing paralyzed. They had lived with this fear for years, but when it returned, they realized they had never truly been prepared. At 9 o'clock, the bells began to toll, though no one was in the tower. One by one, the villagers collapsed where they stood, eyes closing as if struck by some invisible force. Travelers watching from the hills said the fog consumed the town in minutes, and then all was silent. For days, no one dared enter. When at last the bravest crept into the valley, they found Ravenshollow empty again. Not abandoned, not ruined, but paused. Bread half, sliced on tables, teacups steaming faintly, though they had been untouched for hours, and the villagers, gone. Not a trace of them remained. This time there was no waking. Some insist that Ravenshollow reappears every 30 years, its people waking for a time before the fog swallows them again. Others believe the town was finally claimed by whatever force had toyed with it for decades. And still others whisper that if you find the valley on the right night, you might see the lights of Ravenshollow through the mist, hear the bells ringing in the dark, and even glimpse figures moving behind shuttered windows. But if you do, don't go closer, don't step into the fog, because those who wander too near are said to hear voices calling their names, soft and familiar, urging them to enter, and once you do, you won't come back. Not in this lifetime, perhaps not ever. The story of Ravenshollow is not one you'll find in guidebooks or history texts. It survives in whispers, half-remembered tales told in dimly lit pubs, a warning to travelers who stray too far from the beaten path. But whether you believe it or not, remember this. If you ever find yourself walking in the hills on a foggy night, and you hear the faint sound of bells at 9 o'clock, turn back. No matter how curious you are, no matter how drawn you feel, do not go toward the sound. Because some towns should remain asleep, and some doors once opened can never be closed again,